A king can survive 1,000 enemies, but not the day he decides he no longer wants to live. For 21 days, the doors to the western tower of Blackthorn Palace had remained closed. Every sunrise brought another tray of untouched food. Every sunset carried it away just as full. The royal physicians whispered about failing strength. The generals blamed grief. The servants lowered their voices whenever they crossed the silent hallway, as though even their footsteps might disturb the darkness that had settled behind the heavy oak door. Alpha King Adrian Blackthorn, the most powerful ruler in the Northern Territories, had stopped eating, and no one understood why. He still attended the council when duty demanded it, his broad shoulders wrapped in black, his silver eyes calm and unreadable, issuing precise orders that kept the kingdom running with perfect discipline. Yet the moment each meeting ended, he disappeared into the tower once more, leaving behind untouched banquets prepared by the finest cooks in the realm. Every recipe had been attempted. Thick beef stew simmered for hours. Fresh bread emerged from stone ovens before dawn. Wild herbs were gathered from distant mountains. Sweet berry pies cooled on polished windowsills. Nothing tempted him. Nothing even earned a second glance. The palace kitchens, once filled with lively conversation and the comforting scent of roasted meals, had become a place of quiet frustration. Master chefs argued over spices. Bakers questioned old family recipes. Even visiting nobles sent rare ingredients from neighboring kingdoms, hoping to earn the king's gratitude. Every effort failed. Among the dozens of busy hands scrubbing copper pots and carrying sacks of flour moved a young woman almost no one noticed. Clara Bennett never stood near the grand ovens where celebrated chefs worked. She washed mixing bowls until her fingers wrinkled in warm water, peeled vegetables by the crate, swept scattered flour from cold stone floors, and quietly disappeared before anyone remembered to thank her. At 26, she had learned that invisible people often heard the most important conversations. If His Majesty refuses another meal, one servant whispered that afternoon, the council will panic. Maybe he already knows something we don't, another answered softly. Clara kept rinsing a wooden spoon, pretending not to listen. She had never spoken to the king. She had only seen him once from across the courtyard months earlier, standing beneath falling snow with the stillness of an ancient pine tree. Powerful, distant, untouchable. Yet something about the silence surrounding his empty table unsettled her more each passing day. Late that evening, after the great kitchen had emptied and the fires burned low, Clara noticed a forgotten pot resting near the back stove. It held a simple chicken soup, lightly seasoned with rosemary, onions, carrots, and fresh parsley. Nothing extravagant, just warm enough to comfort someone after a long winter walk. She ladled a single serving into a plain ceramic bowl. No silver tray, no royal seal, no polished cover, just one humble meal prepared with careful hands. Holding the bowl close against the cool night air, Clara climbed the quiet staircase leading toward the western tower. The hallway stood empty except for flickering lanterns that painted soft gold across the stone walls. She stopped several feet from the king's closed door, her heartbeat louder than the silence around her. She knew she should turn back. Instead, she knelt, placed the bowl on the floor, and gently slid it beneath the narrow gap at the bottom of the door before quietly walking away without waiting to see what happened. The next morning, before the first rays of sunlight reached the palace windows, Clara quietly climbed the narrow staircase once again, expecting to find the same untouched bowl waiting outside the heavy door. Instead, she stopped in her tracks. The ceramic bowl was sitting exactly where she had left it, carefully pushed back beneath the narrow gap, polished clean enough to catch the soft glow of the hallway lanterns. Not a single drop of soup remained. She blinked, wondering if one of the guards had removed it during the night, but there were no guards posted outside the western tower anymore. The king had dismissed them days ago, asking only for complete silence. Clara slowly picked up the empty bowl, running her fingertips across its smooth rim. There was no note, no message, no sign that anyone had even acknowledged the quiet act of kindness. Yet somehow, the empty bowl felt more meaningful than any words could have been. She carried it back downstairs before anyone noticed she had been gone. The kitchens came alive shortly afterward with the familiar rhythm of chopping knives, boiling kettles, and fresh bread sliding into brick ovens. Servants hurried between long wooden tables while senior cooks debated the menu for the royal council luncheon. Clara returned to peeling carrots beside the wash station, blending once again into the background where she had always belonged. By mid-morning, whispers spread through the kitchen faster than steam rising from the soup pots. The breakfast tray came back untouched again, one cook sighed. "Everything except the bowl from last night." Another servant quietly replied. "What bowl?" "No one knows." The steward found an empty ceramic bowl inside the king's room. It was not from the royal service. Clara lowered her eyes immediately, pretending to concentrate on slicing celery into neat pieces. Her heartbeat quickened, but no one looked in her direction. Why would they? She was only the kitchen girl who scrubbed floors after everyone else went home. Across the palace, Adrian stood beside the tall arched window of his chamber, watching gray clouds drift across the distant mountains. The room remained as quiet as ever, but something had changed. The sharp ache that had settled inside him for weeks no longer felt quite as heavy. He could still remember the warmth of the simple soup. It had not been extraordinary. It carried no expensive spices, no rare ingredients gathered from distant forests, no elaborate presentation worthy of a king. It tasted honest, familiar. The gentle flavor reminded him of evenings long before the crown rested on his shoulders, when his mother would quietly leave a steaming bowl outside his bedroom after difficult training sessions, never forcing him to eat, only reminding him that someone cared enough to wait. That memory had arrived with the first spoonful, unexpected and painfully beautiful. For the first time in many weeks, Adrian realized he had finished an entire meal without feeling obligated to do so. He turned toward the empty bowl resting on the small wooden table near the fireplace. There was something strangely comforting about its plain appearance. It belonged to someone who had expected nothing in return. No request, no introduction, no attempt to gain favor. Just quiet kindness left at the door of a lonely man. That evening, as darkness settled gently over Blackthorn Palace once more, Clara stood in the kitchen holding another simple bowl, wondering whether the first had been nothing more than a lucky accident. After a long, uncertain breath, she filled it with fresh vegetable stew, wrapped her hands around its warmth, and once again walked alone toward the silent tower. On the third evening, the climb toward the western tower no longer felt like an accident. Clara knew every worn stone step beneath her shoes and every lantern that flickered along the quiet hallway. She still paused before reaching the final corner, listening for voices, but the palace remained wrapped in the same peaceful silence that had settled over it for weeks. The bowl in her hands carried a simple vegetable stew, slow-cooked with potatoes, celery, carrots, sweet onions, and a pinch of thyme from the palace garden. It was the sort of meal that warmed tired hands after a cold day, nothing a royal banquet would ever celebrate. She knelt once more and gently slid the bowl beneath the narrow gap. The ceramic made the faintest sound against the polished floor before disappearing from sight. Clara stood, brushed the flour from her apron, and quietly walked away without looking back. Behind the closed door, Adrian had been sitting beside the fireplace with another untouched royal dinner growing cold across the room. Roasted pheasant glazed with herbs rested beside buttered rolls and crystal glasses filled with sparkling water. None of it appealed to him. The rich aromas only reminded him of formal dinners where every conversation carried the weight of politics instead of comfort. Then he heard the familiar scrape beneath the door. He remained perfectly still. For several moments, he simply stared at the narrow strip of light beneath the heavy oak. Slowly he rose and crossed the room. Waiting there was the plain ceramic bowl again. No silver tray, no polished lid, no royal crest. Just another quiet offering from someone who continued expecting absolutely nothing in return. Adrian carried the bowl to the small wooden table by the fire instead of the grand dining table that dominated the room. The warm scent of fresh vegetables filled the air. It was gentle rather than impressive, familiar rather than luxurious. He lifted the first spoonful and closed his eyes. Once again memories arrived before the taste had fully settled. He remembered rainy afternoons as a boy when his mother insisted that the simplest meals often carried the greatest comfort because they reminded people they were never truly alone. He had not allowed himself to think about those afternoons in years. Yet somehow this unknown cook had reached them without asking permission. Downstairs, life inside the palace continued as though nothing extraordinary was happening. The council celebrated that the king had attended another morning meeting with clearer eyes. The physicians quietly noticed that his hands no longer trembled from exhaustion. The servants whispered that perhaps the darkest days had finally begun to pass. No one understood why. Even the head chef stood confused after discovering another untouched royal dinner while hearing rumors that an ordinary ceramic bowl had once again returned empty. He demanded that every cook explain whether anyone had prepared food outside the official menu. One by one they denied it. Clara kept washing copper pots near the back sink, saying nothing. She did not consider herself brave. In truth, every evening she expected someone to stop her before she reached the tower. Yet each morning the empty bowl appeared waiting for her. That silent exchange became their only conversation. No names, no faces, no promises. Only one warm meal offered with quiet kindness, and one empty bowl returned with equal silence. As another night settled over Blackthorn Palace, Adrian placed the clean ceramic bowl carefully beside the fireplace instead of sending it back with the other dishes. For reasons he could not explain, he no longer wanted it to disappear among the palace kitchens. Somewhere beyond the walls, an unseen pair of hands had reminded the strongest king in the realm that even the heaviest heart could begin healing one small meal at a time. By the end of the week, the quiet ritual had become the one moment Adrian found himself waiting for. He never admitted it aloud, not even to himself, but every evening his attention drifted toward the bottom of the heavy oak door long before the palace clock announced the final hour. The royal dinners still arrived on polished silver trays, carried by servants who bowed without speaking. The meals remained flawless, prepared with the finest cuts of meat, imported cheeses, delicate pastries, and rare spices that crossed hundreds of miles before reaching Blackthorn Palace. Adrian thanked the servants with the same calm courtesy he had always shown, yet after they departed, the untouched feast cooled beside the fireplace, while his eyes returned to the narrow strip of light beneath the door. Somewhere beyond it, someone walked the hallway with soft, careful footsteps. Somewhere beyond it, a pair of ordinary hands carried something far more valuable than luxury. That evening the familiar sound finally came. A gentle scrape against the stone floor. Adrian did not hesitate. Before the footsteps had completely faded, he crossed the room and lifted another plain ceramic bowl into his hands. This time it held creamy potato soup with fresh herbs scattered across the surface, accompanied by a small slice of homemade bread wrapped neatly in a clean linen cloth. He smiled without realizing it. It was the first genuine smile that had touched his face in longer than anyone inside the palace could remember. The bread was still warm. Whoever had baked it had done so only minutes before climbing the tower. Adrian broke off a piece and tasted it slowly. The flavor carried no extravagance. It carried care. The realization settled quietly inside him. The person beyond the door was not trying to impress a king. They were simply hoping another human being would eat. Downstairs, Clara had begun adjusting her daily routine without anyone noticing. She arrived before sunrise to help knead bread dough while the senior bakers were still organizing their stations. She volunteered for tasks no one wanted, knowing the extra work allowed her to save small portions of fresh vegetables before they were transformed into elaborate royal dishes. Every ingredient she carried upstairs came from leftovers that would otherwise have been forgotten. She never considered it charity. She only believed that warm food should never be wasted if it could comfort someone. As the days passed, the palace itself began changing in subtle ways. The physicians quietly reduced their daily visits. The king's meetings lasted longer, his voice steadier than before. Courtyard guards noticed that Adrian sometimes paused beside the castle gardens after council sessions instead of immediately returning to his chamber. Even the palace musicians resumed practicing in the Eastern Hall after weeks of silence, filling distant corridors with gentle violin melodies that drifted through open windows. Hope returned so gradually that no one could identify the exact day it arrived. Yet one mystery continued growing. Every official meal remained untouched while another anonymous bowl always returned perfectly clean. The royal steward inspected every kitchen shelf, questioned every cook, and reviewed every inventory record, convinced someone had ignored palace protocol. Nothing explained the mystery. No missing silverware. No missing ingredients. Only ordinary ceramic bowls that appeared and disappeared without witnesses. Late that night, Adrian placed the empty bowl beside the others he had quietly begun collecting near the bookshelf. For simple bowls rested there now, each one carrying a memory stronger than any royal treasure. He studied them for a long moment before looking once more toward the closed door. Whoever stood beyond it knew nothing about his title, his victories, or the weight of the crown. Somehow that made every meal taste even more honest. And for the first time since the silence had taken hold of his heart, Adrian found himself wondering not what tomorrow's soup might be, but who the unseen soul was that believed he was still worth feeding. The quiet mystery that had begun with a single bowl soon became impossible for Adrian to ignore. Every evening the unseen visitor arrived with perfect consistency. Never too early, never too late, always leaving before he reached the door. Whoever they were understood silence as well as he did. They never asked whether he enjoyed the meal. They never waited for gratitude. They simply appeared like the gentle rhythm of the seasons, offering warmth without expectation. Adrian found himself studying every detail of the bowls after finishing each meal. One carried the faint scent of fresh rosemary even after it had been washed. Another had a tiny crack near the base, carefully repaired long ago instead of being discarded. They were ordinary pieces from the palace kitchens, but they had been chosen by someone who valued usefulness over appearance. During the next council meeting, the ministers exchanged relieved glances as the king accepted a cup of tea and remained focused through hours of discussion. Reports about harvests, trade routes, and village festivals received his full attention once again. His questions were thoughtful. His decisions were steady. When the meeting concluded, Lord Harrington, the elderly royal steward, cautiously approached. "Your Majesty," he said, "the palace is grateful to see your strength returning." Adrian offered a polite nod. "Strength returns for many reasons, Lord Harrington." The steward hesitated before speaking again. "Would your Majesty like the royal kitchens to prepare something special this evening?" Adrian looked toward the palace windows where the afternoon sunlight painted long golden lines across the marble floor. "No," he answered calmly. "Prepare dinner as usual for everyone else." The unusual reply spread through the palace before sunset. The head chef frowned in confusion. The servants whispered among themselves. Why would the king continue refusing every magnificent meal while secretly accepting something no one could explain? Curiosity slowly replaced concern. Down in the kitchens, Clara remained unaware that she had become the center of a mystery. She spent the afternoon sorting baskets of freshly harvested vegetables delivered by nearby farmers. One crooked carrot was set aside because it was considered too imperfect for the royal table. A slightly misshapen potato joined it. Clara smiled softly and placed both into her basket. She had always believed that vegetables did not lose their goodness simply because they looked different. As evening approached, she prepared a hearty chicken and rice soup with sweet corn, celery, onions, and black pepper. It was humble, filling, and comforting, the kind of meal that quietly restored tired spirits. Meanwhile, Adrian made a decision he had resisted for days. He would not force open the door or command guards to search the hall. Whoever had shown him such kindness deserved better than fear. Instead, he moved the chair beside the fireplace closer to the entrance and waited. The room was lit only by dancing flames and a single lantern resting on a wooden shelf. Time passed slowly until at last he heard it again. Soft footsteps approached from the far end of the corridor, light enough that anyone else might have missed them. Then came the familiar whisper of ceramic sliding gently across polished stone. Adrian remained perfectly still. He listened as the footsteps paused for only a heartbeat before quietly retreating down the hallway. He counted to 10 before opening the door for the first time in weeks. The corridor beyond was empty. Only the warm bowl rested outside beneath the lantern's gentle glow, and at the far end of the hallway, just before disappearing around the corner, he caught the briefest glimpse of a simple blue apron moving silently into the shadows. Clara did not notice the door had opened. By the time Adrian stepped into the hallway, she had already disappeared beyond the stone archway, carrying her empty basket back toward the service stairs. She never looked behind her because she believed the quiet exchange only worked if it remained anonymous. In her heart, the meals had never been about meeting a king. They had always been about making sure another person did not face another lonely night with an empty table. The following morning began like every other. Before dawn, Clara swept flour from the bakery floor while the first loaves rose beside the warm ovens. She polished copper pots until they reflected the orange glow of the fire, then sorted fresh herbs delivered from the palace gardens. As she reached for a bundle of rosemary, an elderly voice behind her spoke with gentle warmth. "You always choose the freshest leaves first." Clara turned and smiled. It was Martha Collins, the oldest woman in the royal kitchens. Time had softened Martha's posture, but never her eyes, which still carried quiet wisdom gathered over decades of service. "My grandmother taught me that herbs should smell alive before they ever touch the pot," Clara answered. Martha nodded knowingly. "Your grandmother was a remarkable cook." Clara's smile brightened. "She used to tell me that people remember how a meal made them feel long after they forget what was served." Martha laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like Eleanor Bennet." Clara carefully tied the herbs together with kitchen twine. She never worked in a grand restaurant. She always said feeding one tired soul mattered more than impressing a crowded room. Martha rested one hand against the wooden table, her expression drifting toward memories many years old. "Your grandmother spent nearly 20 years inside this palace," she said quietly. Clara looked up in surprise. "She did." Martha nodded. "She was never the royal chef. She refused the position more than once. She preferred preparing simple meals for Queen Catherine whenever the queen wished to escape formal banquets." Clara blinked. Her grandmother had spoken fondly of an old friend named Catherine, but had never revealed she had been the queen herself. Martha continued, her voice almost a whisper. "The queen believed kindness could not be commanded. It had to arrive freely. On difficult evenings, she would ask your grandmother for vegetable soup, homemade bread, or warm apple tea instead of extravagant feasts. She always said comfort carried its own kind of strength." Clara looked down at the herbs in her hands as forgotten childhood memories quietly returned. She remembered standing on a wooden stool beside her grandmother, learning how slowly stirring a soup allowed every flavor to find its place. She remembered hearing the same gentle advice again and again. Cook with patience. Season with honesty. Feed the heart before the stomach. Across the palace, Adrian sat alone beside the growing collection of plain ceramic bowls arranged neatly on the bookshelf. His gaze lingered on them while fragments of distant memories continued to surface. The warmth of homemade bread, the scent of rosemary drifting through quiet evenings, the peaceful certainty that someone cared without asking for recognition. He still did not know the name of the person leaving the meals, but he knew one thing with complete certainty. No trained royal chef could recreate memories this personal by accident. Somewhere inside Blackthorn Palace lived someone whose kindness had been shaped by an older tradition, one that valued compassion above ceremony. As twilight approached once more, Clara gently folded another clean linen cloth around a fresh loaf of bread, completely unaware that the invisible path between her quiet kitchen and the king's silent chamber was slowly uncovering a history that had connected their lives long before either of them had ever met. That evening, a gentle rain settled over Blackthorn Palace, tapping softly against the tall windows and washing the stone courtyards in silver light. Clara waited until the busiest hours in the kitchens had passed before preparing another meal. She chose a simple beef and barley soup, letting it simmer slowly until the vegetables became tender and the rich aroma filled the quiet room. Beside the bowl, she wrapped a small piece of fresh bread in clean linen, just as her grandmother had always done. "No one should eat alone without bread," Eleanor Bennet used to say, and the memory brought a quiet smile to Clara's face. She carried the bowl through the familiar service corridors, her footsteps almost disappearing beneath the sound of falling rain. As always, she reached the western tower, knelt beside the heavy oak door, and carefully slid the meal beneath the narrow opening. But before she could stand, something unexpected happened. Instead of hearing the usual silence, she heard footsteps moving toward her from the other side. They were calm, steady, and unmistakably close. Clara's heart skipped. Every instinct told her to leave immediately, but before she could reach the staircase, the old hinges released a quiet breath, and the door slowly opened behind her. She froze. For the first time, the silent room behind the door was no longer hidden. Warm firelight spilled into the hallway, casting long golden shadows across the stone floor. Adrian stood in the doorway, taller than she had imagined, dressed simply in a dark sweater and plain trousers instead of royal robes. Without the ceremonial clothing, he looked less like the distant ruler everyone feared and more like a man who had carried an invisible burden for far too long. Neither of them spoke. Clara lowered her eyes immediately, believing she had broken some important rule simply by remaining there. She tightened her hands around the empty basket, preparing herself for a polite dismissal. Instead, Adrian looked down at the steaming bowl resting near his feet before returning his gaze to the young woman standing quietly before him. The blue apron she wore was lightly dusted with flour. A loose strand of golden brown hair had escaped from beneath her scarf during the climb upstairs. She looked nothing like the celebrated chefs who proudly presented elaborate banquets. She looked tired from honest work, yet peaceful in a way the palace itself had not felt in weeks. Adrian finally spoke, his voice gentle from disuse rather than authority. "Was it you?" Clara hesitated before giving the smallest nod. "Yes, Your Majesty." She expected another question, perhaps even in order to stop. Instead, Adrian looked toward the bowl once again, and a faint smile touched his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. The simple words caught Clara completely by surprise. She had imagined countless endings to this secret routine, but gratitude had never been one of them. "I only hoped you would eat," she answered honestly. Adrian studied her expression for a long moment. There was no ambition in her eyes, no fear beyond ordinary nervousness, and no expectation of reward. She had crossed the palace every evening carrying warmth to someone she barely knew simply because she believed it was the right thing to do. In that quiet hallway, surrounded by rain and lantern light, Adrian understood something that had escaped him through years of power and ceremony. Titles could command loyalty. Wealth could purchase excellence. But kindness offered freely could never be demanded. As Clara turned to leave, believing their brief conversation had ended, Adrian spoke once more, his voice carrying a quiet sincerity that lingered in the stillness. "Tomorrow evening," he said, "if you are willing, do not leave before I have the chance to thank you properly." The following evening, Clara arrived at the Western Tower carrying a bowl of slow-cooked chicken noodle soup, its gentle aroma rising into the cool air as she climbed the familiar staircase. Her hands felt steadier than they had the night before, yet her heart still carried quiet uncertainty. She had replayed the king's words throughout the day while washing dishes, kneading bread, and chopping vegetables. "Tomorrow evening, if you are willing, do not leave before I have the chance to thank you properly." They were simple words, but they had followed her through every corner of the kitchen. When she reached the oak door, she placed the bowl on the floor as she always had, but this time she remained standing instead of turning away. Only a few moments passed before the door opened. Adrian stepped into the hallway with the warmth of the fire behind him, holding the empty bowl from the previous evening. He handed it back with both hands instead of passing it casually, a quiet gesture of respect that caught Clara by surprise. "I believe this belongs to you," he said with a gentle smile. Clara accepted the bowl carefully. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Adrian looked toward the fresh meal waiting between them before speaking again. "You have done something that the finest physicians, the greatest cooks, and my closest advisors could not accomplish." Clara lowered her eyes. "I only made soup." Adrian shook his head slowly. "No, you reminded me that someone still cared whether I came to the table." His voice remained calm, but there was an honesty within it that few people had ever heard from their king. He glanced toward the rain-washed windows at the end of the corridor before continuing. "After my mother passed away, every formal dinner became another reminder that the seat beside me would always remain empty. I convinced myself that if eating only brought memories of loss, then perhaps it was easier to stop altogether." Clara listened quietly without interrupting. She understood that some grief could not be repaired with advice. Sometimes it only needed another person willing to remain nearby, without demanding anything in return. "My grandmother used to tell me," Clara said softly, "that food cannot erase sorrow, but it can give people enough strength to carry it one more day." Adrian smiled with quiet recognition. "Your grandmother was Eleanor Bennet." Clara looked up in surprise. "You knew her name?" Adrian nodded. "Not until recently. Martha Collins helped me remember. My mother often spoke about a woman who believed every meal should begin with kindness before seasoning. I never realized they were the same person." A peaceful silence settled between them. The hallway no longer felt like the lonely place where bowls were exchanged in secret. It felt like a bridge connecting two lives shaped by the same gentle wisdom. Adrian looked directly at Clara for the first time without the distance of rank standing between them. "Power taught me how to protect a kingdom," he said. "Your kindness reminded me how to care for myself." Clara felt tears gathering but blinked them away with a small smile. "Then my grandmother's lessons found the right home after all." Adrian picked up the fresh bowl and inhaled the comforting aroma before looking back at her once more. "Tomorrow, I will join the council for the full day, and afterward I would like to thank you in front of the people who deserve to know why their king is standing again." Clara's eyes widened with surprise, but before she could answer, Adrian added with quiet certainty, "Not because you served a king, Clara Bennett, but because you treated a lonely man as though he was worth saving." The next afternoon, sunlight poured through the towering windows of the great council hall, filling Blackthorn Palace with a warmth that had been absent for many weeks. Ministers, advisors, guards, and servants gathered for the final meeting of the day, quietly noticing the difference before a single word was spoken. Adrian stood at the head of the long oak table with steady shoulders and clear eyes, listening carefully to every report before offering thoughtful decisions with the calm confidence that had once defined his reign. The fear that had shadowed the palace had quietly lifted, replaced by something far more powerful than relief. It was hope. When the meeting came to an end, the council expected the king to dismiss everyone as usual. Instead, Adrian remained standing. "Before you leave," he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall, "there is someone you should meet." Curious glances filled the room as the great doors opened once more. Lord Harrington stepped inside, followed by Clara Bennett, who still wore the same simple blue apron she had been wearing while helping prepare the evening meal. She paused uncertainly just inside the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with so many eyes turning toward her at once. Several palace cooks exchanged puzzled looks, struggling to understand why the quiet kitchen girl had been invited into the royal council chamber. Adrian walked toward her instead of waiting for her to approach him. The gesture alone surprised everyone present. He stopped a respectful distance away before turning to face the gathered court. "Many of you believe the physicians restored my strength," he began. "Others believe time alone healed my heart. Both were mistaken." The room became perfectly still. Adrian continued with quiet honesty. "The person who brought me back was never seeking recognition. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. Every evening, she carried a simple meal to my door because she believed no one should face another day hungry and alone." Clara lowered her eyes, wishing the attention would disappear, but Adrian's next words gently lifted the weight from her shoulders. "She reminded me that compassion cannot be ordered by a crown or purchased with gold. It can only be given freely." The elderly Martha Collins smiled softly from the back of the room, already knowing the truth before anyone else. Adrian looked toward Clara again. "Your grandmother once taught my mother that every meal should feed the heart before the stomach. You honored that lesson without knowing how deeply it would reach." Clara finally met his eyes. "She always believed kindness should stay simple," she answered quietly. Adrian nodded. "Then she gave this kingdom a gift through you." Without ceremony or grand display, Adrian invited Clara to walk beside him toward the smaller dining room overlooking the palace gardens. Waiting there was not a magnificent banquet, but a modest wooden table set for 2 people. 2 plain ceramic bowls rested at its center, filled with the same comforting soup Clara had prepared that morning. The collection of simple bowls Adrian had quietly saved now stood neatly arranged on a nearby shelf, each one a reminder that healing had arrived one evening at a time. Clara smiled with surprised gratitude. "You kept them." Adrian looked at the humble collection before answering. "Some treasures are not made of silver." They took their seats together as the golden light of sunset spread across the garden outside. No musicians played. No servants announced the meal. There were only 2 ordinary people sharing warm soup in peaceful silence, grateful that compassion had found its way through a closed door. Beyond the windows, the palace carried on with renewed life, and within its ancient walls a quiet truth remained long after the bowls had been emptied. The greatest strength in any kingdom is not the power to command others. It is the courage to accept kindness when it quietly arrives, asking for nothing in return.